The ash still floated in the wind like slow, dying snowflakes. Arya Stark stood at the broken steps of the Red Keep, boots covered in dust, blood dried under her fingernails. Smoke curled around her like a ghost. Not long ago, this place had echoed, with screams and the roar of dragonfire. Now it was quiet, too quiet. Only the crows dared to speak. She had watched Daenerys die just hours before, watched Jon do it, saw the way his sword slid into the mother of dragons' heart like it belonged. There, Arya hadn't stopped him, she hadn't helped either. She just stood by, silent in the shadows, faceless again in her mind. She didn't feel anything when Daenerys fell. Not hate, not victory, not relief. Just silence. Like the world had exhaled. Jon had walked away afterward like a man already half dead. He whispered something about going north, about ghosts and cold things and never wanting a crown. Arya didn't argue. She just let him go. Maybe that's all anyone could do anymore. Walk away from fire and ruin and try not to look back. But someone had to stay. Someone had to make sure the ashes didn't blow away into more war. So Arya stayed, not because she wanted to rule. 7 hells, no. She didn't even know what ruling meant. She could kill a man with her eyes closed, could move like a shadow through a crowded hall, but sit on a throne made of swords and play at politics. That was Sansa's game. But Sansa wasn't there, and Tyrion had been locked away in chains, muttering to himself in a dark cell. The lords and ladies of Westeros were scattered like bones after a feast, and none of them could agree on anything. Not on Jon, not on Daenerys, not on who should sit where, and in that space, between confusion and chaos, Arya stepped in. She didn't ask for the crown, didn't take it like some power-hungry noble. No, the crown came to her like a wounded bird, limp and heavy. The first to speak her name was Ser Davos. He was tired, older than the war itself, it seemed. "We need someone the people trust," he had said in a room that smelled of smoke and broken stone. "Someone who's seen the worst and still stood." "Arya Stark saved us all," Gendry had added quietly from a corner, eyes not quite meeting hers. "She killed the Night King. She walked through fire and death. She didn't burn." Others joined in, reluctantly at first. Even those who once whispered that the North was too wild, that the Starks were too cold, found themselves nodding, because there was no one else. Not anymore. So when the shattered throne room was cleared, burned nearly to the bones of the stone beneath it, they set up a new seat, not as tall, not as sharp, not as cruel, and they asked Arya to sit. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just stepped forward, slow and steady, and placed one hand on the cold metal armrest. It didn't bite her like it had others. No cuts, no warning, just silence. The people outside the Red Keep watched from behind crumbling walls. Some whispered her name like a prayer, some cried, some said nothing at all, and Arya sat. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by a window, staring out at what was left of King's Landing. The buildings looked like broken teeth. The sky was still grey, like it hadn't decided if the sun was allowed back in yet. She listened to the wind, to the moans of the wounded, to the crackle of faraway fires. Still burning, she remembered her list. All those names, all those deaths, Cersei, the Mountain, Walder Frey, Meryn Trant, so many others, and she thought, what now? She had spent so long becoming no one. Then she became vengeance, then a blade. Now they wanted her to be something else. Again, a queen. But Arya Stark wasn't made for crowns or golden robes or sweet words. She didn't know how to lead armies or build alliances. She knew death, she knew survival, and she knew justice. So maybe that's what she would give them. Not a ruler of politics, but a ruler of truth. Sharp, cold, unbending. She would rule like she fought, with silent speed and steel. No more games, no more lies, no more fire, only ice. The days that followed were slow and strange. People came in waves, lords with tired eyes, soldiers with missing fingers, small folk wrapped in rags and grief. They came not to kneel, not exactly, but to see, to believe. That Arya Stark of all. People now sat where dragons once ruled and kings once bled. Arya hated the throne room. It stank of smoke and ghosts. The walls still bore black stains where fire had kissed stone. The new seat they built for her was plain, made of wood and dark iron. No jagged swords, no sharp edges. Just a chair. But even so, it felt too big for her. She didn't wear a crown, didn't sit high above anyone. When people came with requests, food, safety, water, she listened. That's all. Just listened. No empty promises, no clever words. Just her eyes, watching like a wolf from the shadows. Most were too afraid to ask for more. Tyrion had been freed from his cell on her orders. He came to her limping, thinner than before, his beard untrimmed, eyes heavy. He looked at her like someone expecting a blade between the ribs. "You know, I once told Daenerys she'd break the wheel," he said on the third day, his voice quiet and dry. "Instead, she set fire to the whole damn thing. Now you sit in her place. What will you do with what's left?" Arya didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, then out the window where children played in ruins and mothers built homes from broken wood. "I'll make sure it doesn't turn again," she said. Tyrion gave a slow, tired smile. "That sounds like something I might believe." He offered to help and she let him, not as a hand, not officially. She hated the title, but he stayed close. He had a mind for things she didn't care to understand. Grain, taxes, letters from distant lords still unsure if Westeros had a queen, or just a ghost in the castle. Gendry stayed too. Arya hadn't asked him to. He just stayed, helped the blacksmiths rebuild, helped calm the Riverlands when a few barons tried to declare independence. He didn't say much to her, not at first. But when he looked at her, it was with something she didn't recognize. Not love, not exactly, more like fear. Not the kind that came from danger, but the kind that came from watching someone turn into something else. Like watching a wildfire and realizing it's beautiful and could kill you. Arya kept her distance. The council came together slowly. Brienne rode in from the Vale, her armor scratched and dull. She bowed to Arya like it pained her, like the world had turned upside down. Sam came from Old Town, carrying books and scrolls and ideas no one asked for, but everyone needed. Even Sansa sent word from Winterfell, short and cold. "The North remains free, but I hope you rule well." Arya read it twice, then tucked it away. She didn't blame Sansa. She never had. Her sister wanted what Arya didn't. Structure, law, something you could build on and not just tear down. They were too different now, too far apart. Maybe they always had been. Still, Arya missed her. Nights were the hardest. When the halls were empty and the noise of the day had faded, her mind walked old paths. Back to Harrenhal, back to the twins, back to Braavos and the cold room where she learned to kill without mercy. She dreamed of faces. Some she wore, some she took, some she loved. She dreamed of her father's voice. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. She lived by that now. When a man was caught abusing women in the camps outside the walls, Arya didn't send him to a cell. She walked to him herself, listened to the women, asked no guards for help. Then she drew needle, clean and swift. She didn't flinch. The people began to talk. Some called her the Silent Queen, others the wolf on the throne. To some she was a savior, to others a shadow in daylight. But peace began to grow, shaky and soft like new grass after winter. No fires, no screams, just slow rebuilding. Still Arya didn't smile. She walked the halls like a ghost, sat in her chair like it burned her every time. She ruled because she had to, not because she wanted to, and everyone knew it. That's why, when the message came from the west, that ships with black sails had landed, that a new power rose beyond the sea, no one knew how Arya would respond. But she just stood, tightened the gloves on her hands and said, "Send a raven to the port. Tell them I'm coming." Tyrion stepped forward, uncertain. "You mean to go yourself?" Arya nodded. "If this is a threat, I'll see it with my own eyes. If it's peace, I'll hear it with my own ears." And just like that, the Queen of the Ashes picked up her sword again. The docks at Blackwater Bay smelled of salt, fish, and old blood. Arya stood at the edge of the harbour, cloaked in deep grey, her face half covered against the wind. The waves rolled in slow and heavy, like they were carrying secrets. Behind her, a handful of guards kept their distance, not because she needed them, but because they didn't dare leave her alone. No one let their queen walk unguarded, even if she didn't ask for guards in the first place. 3 black-sailed ships floated just beyond the pier, foreign and silent. No sigils, no banners, just a thin line of shadow and wood cutting through the sea. No one knew who they were. They hadn't attacked, they hadn't spoken, they had just appeared. Arya didn't like that. She hated silence when it wasn't her own. Tyrion caught up with her, breathless, his cloak flapping like a bird's. "Broken wing. They still won't answer our ravens," he said. "We don't know what they want." "They'll tell me," Arya said simply. A small boat rode from the lead ship, gliding over the grey water with barely a ripple. When it reached the dock, one figure stepped out, tall, thin, pale skin wrapped in silver armour that looked polished but worn. No sword at his side, only a long, twisted staff carved with symbols Arya didn't recognize. He bowed low, too low, like he was mocking her. "I am Vaelor of Nithen," he said, his voice smooth and sharp like a dagger wrapped in silk. "And I bring greetings to the girl who sits where fire once ruled." Arya didn't speak. She just watched him. Vaelor smiled, unfazed. "You do not ask why I've come? If you came to talk," she said, "start talking." He looked around, eyes scanning the scorched towers, the broken walls, the rebuilders with hammers and burned hands. "You've built your kingdom on bones, impressive and bold, but bones do not hold power forever." Arya's voice was flat. "Neither does fire, or ships." He smiled wider, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We come with an offer," he said, raising the staff. "Nithen has long watched the chaos of Westeros, your dragons, your wars, your endless lust for crowns. We stayed silent. But now, there is no dragon, no mad queen, no storm-born heir, only a girl with many faces who holds the throne in quiet hands." He stepped closer, too close. "We offer alliance, knowledge, a joining of lands. You as Queen of the West, us rulers of the sea. Together, peace can spread like roots across the world." Tyrion shifted uneasily. Arya said nothing. "And if I refuse?" she asked after a long pause. Vaelor tilted his head. "Then we will leave. But the sea does not forget my queen. And neither do those who sail it." Arya looked past him to the ship, to the others watching, to the still silence hanging above the water. "Your ships stay," she said coldly. "You go back. I'll send word when I decide. For the first." "In time," Vaelor's smile cracked. "Just a bit." "Very well," he said, bowing again. "But choose quickly, girl of many deaths. Not all who come from the sea bring gifts." As he turned and walked back to the boat, Arya didn't move. She stared at the water, at the strange ships, at the way the sky seemed darker now than it had a moment ago. Tyrion stepped beside her, voice low. "You think they're dangerous?" "They didn't come to offer peace," Arya said. "They came to measure what's left, to see how weak we are. And what will you do?" She turned, the wind lifting her cloak behind her like wings. "I'll remind them whose kingdom this is." That night, Arya walked the ruins of the keep alone. Her boots echoed off stone and silence. She remembered the old throne room, the dragons. On the wall, the fire in Daenerys' eyes. She remembered the screams of children, the smell of burning flesh. She thought about the ships, the silver-eyed stranger. The offer dressed as peace, but heavy with warning, and then she whispered to the dark, "If they want war, they'll get silence first, then steel." Arya Stark didn't need dragons. She was the fire now, and winter hadn't left. It had simply taken the throne. The storm hit just after midnight. Thunder rolled like the growl of some great beast in the dark. Rain hammered the broken stone of King's Landing, washing away dust and blood, but not fear. The black-sailed ships in the bay didn't move. Not a flicker of light from within, not a sound. They just floated, still and watching. Arya stood on the battlements above the harbour, drenched and unblinking. She hadn't slept since Vaelor's visit. Something about him had clawed into her thoughts and refused to leave. His words, his eyes, the quiet confidence of someone who knew more than they said. She didn't trust it. She never had faith in pretty offers. Gendry appeared beside her, shaking rain from his hair, holding out a cloak. "You'll freeze standing up here." "I felt colder," she said, not taking her eyes off the ships. He sighed, draping the cloak over her shoulders anyway. "Tyrion's worried. He should be. About you, Arya." That made her glance at him. Just for a moment. "You haven't eaten, haven't spoken to the council. You just watch." Arya didn't answer. The truth was simple. She didn't trust anyone else to watch. Everyone else saw ships. She saw something worse. The calm before a new war. "Do you remember what I told you once?" Gendry asked after a beat. "Back when we were running from Lannisters and sleeping in barns?" She gave a tired nod. "You said I'd never stop moving." He smiled sadly. "And now you've stopped." "But I don't think that's peace, Arya. I think it's something else." Arya's jaw tightened. "I stopped," she said, "so no one else has to run." He didn't press her after that. But in the hours that followed, her fears proved right. It started with screams near the docks, then fires, then silence. By the time Arya reached the shore, the guards she sent were dead, throats cut, eyes wide open to the sky. No signs of struggle, no warnings, no alarms, just blood on the stones and a trail leading toward the city. She crouched beside one of the bodies, fingers touching the wound. Clean, precise. Too precise. She stood, eyes scanning the shadows, the alleys, the rooftops. "Assassins," she muttered. She didn't run back to the keep. She moved like she used to, slipping through darkness, knife in hand, body low and quiet. She didn't wear her crown tonight. Just the face of the girl she used to be, the girl who survived Harrenhal, who served the many-faced god, who learned to kill in silence. As she turned down an alley near the old flea-bottom market, she heard it. Footsteps. Fast. Light. Too careful. To be a common thief. Arya spun, blade ready, and the attacker was already mid-air, a shadow with twin daggers flashing in the rain. They clashed hard, blades ringing against each other in the dark. Arya twisted low, ducked under a swipe, and slammed her shoulder into the figure's ribs. They hit the wall, gasping. The hood fell back. A girl. No older than Arya had been during the war. Pale skin, shaved head, cold, flat eyes. No fear in them. Arya held her blade to the girl's throat. "Who sent you?" The girl didn't speak. Didn't blink. She smiled, and then, without warning, bit down hard on something in her mouth. Arya saw the twitch of her jaw, the flick of her tongue, and then foam. Blood spilled from her lips. Her eyes rolled back. She died. With the same quiet defiance she'd fought with, Arya stood still. Rain washed the blood down the stones. This wasn't just an attack. It was a message. Someone had trained these people. Not bandits. Not mercenaries. Faceless, Arya's grip. On Needle tightened until her knuckles went white. Back at the keep, Tyrion was waiting, frantic. "What happened?" "We heard." "They're not from Neathen," she said, cutting him off, his brow furrowed. "Then who?" "They're like—" Tyrion paled. "You mean the ones who taught you, the House of Black and White?" Arya nodded slowly. "They're not here for peace. They're here for me." She walked past him, dripping, angry and quiet. They trained me to serve death, she whispered. Now they think I've defied it. Tyrion followed, half whispering. What do they want? Arya's face was stone. They want the throne empty. She didn't say it, but the truth was already forming in her mind. They had sent her once to be no one. Now they would send many to erase someone. And Arya Stark, Queen of the Ashes, would have to kill what made her who she was. By morning, she'd already made up her mind. Arya sat at the edge of her chambers, the sound of rain tapping faintly on the windows behind her. Her cloak hung off one shoulder. Needle lay across her lap. She stared at it like it was a part of her body, a limb, a memory. Tyrion stood by the door, half-dressed, rubbing his temples. You can't go to Braavos alone. I'm not asking permission. You're the queen. I didn't ask for that either, Tyrion frowned. You want to march into the lion's den? No, worse, into the god's temple and face them? Arya finally looked at him. I'm not marching. I'm going back home. There was no convincing her. He knew that. Arya had the same stillness Ned Stark had once worn, like a second skin. When she decided, the world just had to move around her. I'll need a ship, she said. Something fast, small, nothing grand. Tyrion exhaled. You'll take guards. I'll take two. Two? One to sail, one to watch the sail. He laughed, tired and bitter. You'll be killed. I'll be seen. That's all they want, to remind me who I was. And if they want more than that, Arya stood slowly, then I'll remind them who I've become. Gendry didn't speak when she told him. He just stood there, jaw clenched, fists at his sides. When she finished explaining, he looked away, his voice low. You don't have to prove anything to them, not anymore. I'm not doing it for them, she said. He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. You still leaving me behind? She hesitated. Just a beat. You belong here. That's not the same as wanting to stay. Their eyes met, and for a flicker she wasn't queen or assassin or Stark. Just Arya. The girl who kissed him once in a dark hallway before everything fell apart. But she turned away. If I don't come back. He stepped forward, voice sharp. Don't say that. Arya gave him a small, almost sad smile. If I don't, keep the kingdom steady. You'll help Tyrion. I'd rather help you. I know. And that was the end of it. The ship cut across the narrow sea like a blade. Arya stood at the bow, wind against her face, eyes locked on the horizon. The sea was grey and endless, but she didn't blink. Behind her, the two guards she chose, old veterans with quiet mouths and sharper eyes, kept to their duties without questions. Braavos crept into view like a memory. Tall towers wrapped in fog, canals that glistened like veins. The Titan still, standing with one arm raised as if in warning. As the ship passed under its gate, Arya felt something twist in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was something colder. The House of Black and White hadn't changed. It never would. The doors still stood. Half open, still black on one side, white on the other. No guards, no warnings. Just silence. Arya stepped onto the dock, her boots echoing softly against the stone. One of the guards tried to follow. She raised a hand. No further. The man stopped, uncertain. What if you don't come out? Arya turned her head slightly. Then I was never meant to. She walked into the temple without a sound. Inside it was just as she remembered, cool, dim, and heavy with something older than time. The air tasted like stone and dust. The room of faces waited beyond the curtain. Just out of sight, a voice echoed from the dark. You left with a name. Arya didn't flinch. I earned it. A shadow stepped forward. The same man who once guided her, taught her, broke her, Jaqen H'ghar. His hair was thinner, his eyes just as cold. You served death, then defied it. Why? I didn't defy death, Arya said. I used what I learned to stop a greater one. And now you sit on a throne made of power. I didn't take it. I was asked. He smiled slightly. So was every tyrant. Arya stepped closer. Is that why you sent the girl? To kill me before I became one? She was not sent, he said. She volunteered. Arya's brow furrowed. Why? Because death does not kneel. The room fell silent. Arya's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm not kneeling. No, he said, you're standing on the edge of a blade. They walked in circles around each other, quiet and tense like two wolves testing the wind. Arya could feel it in her bones, the weight of her past pressing against the woman she had become. You want to take the throne from me? She asked. He stopped. No, he said simply. Death wants only one thing. What? For you, to remember. He stepped back into the shadows. A curtain shifted, a door opened, and beyond it a figure stepped into the light. Another face she knew, her own, staring back at her. Younger, colder, smiling. The younger Arya stared at her without blinking. It was unsettling, not just because it was her face, but because it was her before. The sharp, ruthless girl who trained in the temple, who had whispered names in the dark and thought killing was all she had left. She wore the same plain robes, held her hands the same way, and when she moved, it was with that same silent grace that had taken Arya years to master. Do you remember me? The girl asked. Arya's throat was dry. I remember being you. The girl tilted her head. Then, you remember what you swore. A girl has no name. A girl serves only death. Arya took a step forward. And yet, here you are with my face, reminding me of a life I already walked away from. You didn't walk away, the girl said flatly. You ran. You chose family, love, power. You let go of the gift. Arya narrowed her eyes. I used the gift. I stopped the Night King. I saved thousands. Don't twist that into betrayal. Saved. You them, so you could become queen. I didn't want the throne. The girl's expression didn't change. But you didn't refuse it. Arya clenched her jaw. Jaken's voice echoed softly from the edge of the room. What you took must now be weighed. Death does not forget those who borrow its face. So what? Arya turned toward him. You punish me? You kill me? Send faceless shadows until I fall? No, Jaken said, stepping forward. We give you a choice. The same choice you were given once, long ago. He pointed toward the far wall, toward the table where the vial of poison sat, glimmering like a shard of moonlight. One must die, he said. Arya's heart froze. What? One must die, Jaken repeated. The girl you were, or the woman you've become. A face cannot live in two places. You cannot be both queen and no one. You must choose. Arya felt the room closing in around her. The silence pressed harder than any sword ever had. Her past, her training, her kills, her list, all of it led to this, a final choice. She looked at the girl again. Her face, her eyes, a younger version of herself who had wanted nothing but vengeance. And then she whispered, I already made my choice. The girl tilted her head. Then prove it. Arya reached behind her back. Needle slid into her hand like it belonged there. With no hesitation, the younger Arya lunged, silent, fast, deadly. They collided in the center of the room, blades flashing. The fight was like a mirror breaking over and over. Each move reflected, twisted, challenged. Arya was faster now, more measured, but the girl was pure instinct, pure training, no hesitation, no doubt. They clashed near the table, knocking over candles. Shadows danced wildly. I'm what made you strong, the girl hissed. You made me hollow, Arya snapped back. A cut bloomed across her forearm. She spun, dodged low, sliced upward, and felt Needle find flesh. The girl stumbled, shocked. Blood dripped from her side. Arya moved without thinking, disarmed her, slammed her to the ground, pressed Needle to her throat. The girl gasped, struggling. You're nothing without me, she whispered. Arya's eyes burned. I'm everything because I left you behind. And she drove the blade in. Silence. Jacen stepped forward as the girl's body faded, slowly, like smoke, like illusion. Like she had never truly been there at all. Arya stood over the spot where she fell, chest heaving. "That wasn't her," she said quietly. "That was me. A test." Jacen nodded. "A reminder." He handed her a small silver coin. "The gift is yours to refuse. Forever. No more faces will come. No more death from the temple." Arya stared at the coin, heavy in her palm, the mark of the faceless men. "You're letting me go?" "No," he said. "You've already gone. But now, death lets you go." She didn't say thank you. Didn't bow. She just turned and walked out, back into the light, back toward the ship. When her boots touched the dock again, her guard stared at her, wide-eyed. "You're alive?" Arya nodded. Just barely. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled, not out of victory but out of clarity. The ghosts of Braavos were behind her now, and Westeros still needed its queen. The sea was calmer on the way back, but Arya's mind wasn't. She stood on the deck, watching the waters part in front of her ship like the path ahead was finally clear. She had faced herself in Braavos, killed the part of her that clung to silence, to death, to being no one. And yet, as she returned to Westeros, something still clung to her ribs like ice. This time she knew it wasn't fear. It was something worse, expectation. She had survived the impossible again. But now, the people would want answers, proof, leadership, and enemies. They would want weakness. She arrived back in King's Landing just as the city began to bloom. Spring was crawling through the rubble. Flowers poked through cracked stone, markets had reopened, children ran in streets where fire once fell. It wasn't much, but it was something, the beginning of something. Gendry was waiting at the dock. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her, wet hair, worn boots, blood still crusted faintly on her sleeve, and stepped forward. "You came back," he said. Arya gave a half-smile. Wasn't planning to stay away. He stared a moment longer, then pulled her into a tight, quick hug. She didn't pull away. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Not good," he said. "There've been meetings, whispers, lords questioning if you left to abandon the throne." Arya raised an eyebrow. "They think I ran?" "Some do. And you let them live," Gendry smirked. "Barely." They walked back through the city side by side. People bowed, though awkwardly, not sure if they were still supposed to. Arya didn't stop them. She barely noticed. Her mind was already racing through names. She stepped into the throne room just as Tyrion was arguing with a tall, red-robed woman from Volantis. Her face turned when Arya entered. "She returns," the woman said. "The faceless queen walks." "Again," Arya frowned. "Who is this?" Tyrion sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Lady Rhaenyra, a representative from the Lord of Light's temple. She came while you were away." "I didn't ask for her," Arya said flatly. Rhaenyra smiled thinly. "And yet I was summoned by destiny." Arya took a step forward. "If you speak in riddles, I won't waste time." The red woman nodded slightly, unshaken. "Then I'll speak clearly. Fire brought ruin to this city. Ice has brought order. But a third force rises from the west, neither fire nor frost. A shadow, old and forgotten." Arya's eyes narrowed. "The ships?" Rhaenyra nodded. "They weren't from Nithen. That was a lie. They come from further, beyond even the known sea. A forgotten kingdom that once served under Valyria before it burned. They were wiped from history. Or so we thought." Tyrion leaned against the table. "We received a raven an hour ago, 12 more ships, and they aren't just docking. They've taken a port." Arya's jaw clenched. "Which port?" "Lannisport." The room fell into silence. Gendry swore under his breath. That wasn't just a port. It was the lifeline to the western coast. Trade, gold, grain, all of it flowed. Through there, Arya turned to her council. Her voice was calm, but cold. Summon the lords, all of them, North, Vale, Riverlands, Storm's End, anyone loyal. Tyrion hesitated. Arya. The North is still under Sansa. She may not come. Then send her a message, Arya said. Tell her we don't have to fight over a crown, but we do have to fight for the realm. And if she refuses... Arya's eyes darkened. Then she'll be watching the world burn again, this time from a seat she thought was safe. That night, Arya sat alone on the balcony above the throne room, watching the flicker of torches light the city below. She remembered her father again, not his voice this time, but his silence, the way he carried weight in his shoulders without ever letting it touch his words. She felt it now. That same weight. Jon had fled north. Sansa ruled the north in quiet. Bran was a ghost to the realm, watching from far away, and she, Arya, the girl who never wanted anything but freedom, was now the last wall between peace and something ancient. Rising from the sea, she looked down at her hands. They still bore faint scars from Braavos. She flexed her fingers slowly. Tomorrow, she'd call the banners. War was coming, but this time she wouldn't fight it alone. The War Council gathered under a grey sky, thick with clouds, but not yet rain. They came in small groups, lords, knights, advisors. Some travelled for days, others rode through the night, unsure if they were answering a queen's call or a warning. The great hall echoed with boots, hushed voices, the clink of armour. Not all came with loyalty. Some came with doubt. A few came with their swords half drawn in their minds, but they came. Arya stood at the centre of it all, dressed not in royal colours, but her old travelling leathers. She wore no crown, she didn't sit on the throne. She stood level with the others, a Stark through and through. Tyrion took the floor first, clearing his throat. We've received confirmed reports. 20 ships docked in Lannisport. No sigils, no demands. They take supplies and fortify their hold, but do not speak to the locals. They've killed no one, but the message is clear. They mean to stay. Lord Royce from the Vale grumbled. So, we wait until they start cutting throats? No, Arya said, stepping forward. We strike first. Murmurs rippled through the room. They've already claimed land that isn't theirs, she continued. If we hesitate, they'll take more. This isn't just a military move, it's a message. They're watching to see if we break. Younger lord from the Reach frowned. And what makes you so sure they won't outmatch us? We don't know what they have, or who leads them. Arya's eyes cut across the room. I've seen what they send when they don't want to be known. They sent assassins. Shadows in the dark. I've killed them. If they want a war in the light now, fine, but I'm done letting strangers test our walls. The room fell silent again. Then a voice broke through from the hall's open doors. We'll stand with her. Heads turned. Sansa Stark stood just inside the chamber, cloaked in furs, flanked by a small northern escort. Her face was unreadable. Arya blinked once, quietly shocked. You came, she said. Sansa stepped forward, slow and sure. I came to see if you were still my sister. She looked around the hall. And it seems you are, just with more swords. Arya almost smiled. Sansa addressed the room. The North remains independent. That hasn't changed. But if this threat spreads beyond Lannisport, it touches all of us. And I won't sit safely in Winterfell while our enemies test the gates. Arya nodded, grateful. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. They planned for hours. Maps spread out, strategies sketched. The army would move west within the week. Supplies would flow from the Reach and Riverlands. The North would send scouts. Brienne of Tarth would command the vanguard. Arya would ride in the front, not behind, because that was who she was. The night before departure, Arya walked the keep alone again. Not as queen, not as warrior, just as herself. She wandered into the old Godswood, where the white tree still stood. It had been scorched in the battle, bark burned black on one side, but it still lived. She knelt beside it, and for the first time in years she whispered a prayer. Not to the gods, not to death, but to her father, to everyone she lost. Help me make this right." In the morning, the army rode out, thousands strong. Flags fluttered. The people watched from crumbled walls and rooftops, eyes wide with hope and fear. Arya led them through the gates, needle at her side, her face calm. No one questioned her anymore, not because of her title, but because of what she'd done to keep it. And when they reached Lannisport, the sky was red with the first fire. The ships were not alone. Black banners now flew atop the hills beyond the coast. Strange beasts carved in gold shimmered on their shields, creatures no one had seen before, symbols that didn't belong to Westeros. Their leader stood at the edge of the cliff, arms folded, waiting. Arya didn't hesitate. She rode forward, alone, until she was close enough to see his face. An older man, with eyes like obsidian and scars like cracked glass across his neck. "I am Arya Stark," she called, "Queen of Westeros. You are trespassing." The man smiled. "I am Carl Valen," he said, "and I've come for what your dragons stole." Arya frowned. "There are no dragons left." "No," he said, "but there is still fire." She gripped Needle, "and I'll be the one to put it out."